as a way to plan your web page. You divide things up into divs and then set divs within divs. And I don't think that I have to remind you about just how tedious this process can be. The Lego method certainly helps, but it does take a while to get all of these divs positioned perfectly. So now when we want our web page to be responsive, we have to think about what this web page will look like across different screen sizes. Does that mean that we have to do this now for each screen size? Well, no, because now we're going to be talking about the grid system. So developers have come up with a way to streamline the process of positioning items on a web page. And so what we do is we use this grid system and we imagine that our screen is divided up into evenly spaced columns. And so for this one, it might be pretty easy for me to imagine that my web page is actually split into 4 even columns. Now, combined with dividing the screen into horizontal rows, and now positioning our elements on the page has become much easier. All you have to know is in which row is our element and how many columns does that element get. So as you can see, we can kind of estimate that each button should get 1 column apiece in the first row. Now this can be applied to any screen size because we don't really care about precisely how big the screen is. We just care about how many columns. And we can define a column as being 25% of the available width. So it doesn't matter precisely how big the screen is. We just know that 25% of the screen's width, whatever that may be, will be applied to each column. And so let's take this a step farther and think about what our web page might look like for different screen sizes. So here I have my phone and I have my tablet and I have my desktop, and I'm just focusing on that top div, the one with the navigation buttons. So I want my buttons to be displayed differently for each screen size, and now how am I going to target these buttons and give them a different amount of columns depending on screen size? As you may have guessed, we'll use our CSS classes. However, it looks like they'll get different classes depending on screen size, and that's exactly right. So let's be clever with how we name our classes so that we'll know which one is being applied under which circumstances. So for example, here on the phone, well, that's a small screen. So let's give these buttons now a class of SM for small, and then 4, because clearly what's happening here is that the buttons are getting all 4 of the 4 available columns. On the tablet, let's give them medium 2, because you can see that here we can estimate that the buttons should each get 2 of the available columns. Here on the tablet, here on the desktop, we're going to give each button 1 column. So let's call this LG for large, and 1. When the screen is large, the buttons will get 1 column. So remember that each button should get all 3 classes. These are the same buttons just being displayed on different screen. So what our job is we need to determine which class is being applied depending on screen size, but each button will get all 3 classes. Now which one gets applied, that's where the fun stuff begins. So we made the small 4 class, the medium 2 class, and the large 1 class. And now we'll have to define them in our CSS. Of course, you can do whatever other styling is necessary, and you may have some to do. For example, you may have to set these buttons so that they line up with each other. But we're focusing on the width. The width depends on the screen size. So do you remember how we determine the screen size? That's right, of course, we're going to do a media query. So let's do our media query and find out what is the size of the user's screen. And then let's say that the screen is less than or equal to 480 pixels, so it's small. When the screen is less than 480 pixels, then we need to know what the small 4 class is. So this is where we will define the small 4 class. We won't define it anywhere else. We're not interested in the small 4 class unless we're on a small screen. So what do we mean by the small 4 class? Well, remember that each column is equal to 25% of the available width. So if we want 4 columns, well, that's 4 times 25%. So the width is going to be 100%. What if the screen is greater than 480 pixels? In that case, we're on a tablet, and we will need to know what medium 2 is. So we will define the class of medium 2, and since that means 2 columns, that means 2 times 25%, so the width will be 50%. And finally, if the screen is greater than or equal to 1024 pixels, well, that's a large screen, so we'll need to define the large 1 class. And by large 1, we mean only 1 column, so the width will be 25%. So let's run through this one more time now that we have our CSS all set up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine that I'm coming to our website on a large desktop. So I have all 3 classes, small 4, medium 2, and large 1. All 3 classes are applied to the buttons. And we'll style the buttons however we need, but then it comes to figuring out what's the width of the button, and we'll do our media query. Since I'm on a large desktop, I'm on this screen here, is the screen less than or equal to 480 pixels? No. So I never even get to find out what the small 4 class is, so that's just completely ignored. I don't know what that is, so I don't use it. Am I greater than 480 pixels? Yes. So I will define the medium 2. So this does get applied, and my width will be 50%. That's not what I wanted though, right? Well, I'm not done. Then I'll continue along, and I will also satisfy this condition of being greater than or equal to 1024 pixels wide. So in that case, we will also define large 1. Large 1 gets defined and applied. But now you see that we have a problem. Medium 2 is saying that the width is 50%. Large 1 is saying that the width is 25%. It can't be both. These cannot both be true at the same time. And so which one will win? Remember that CSS is read from top to bottom. And so the last one is the one that will win. And so we are going to overwrite medium 2. That is overwritten. And now large 1 is the one that's left. And so you will see that all of our buttons are now taking up 1 column of the 4 available columns. As you can see here, we went ahead and built that web page we were talking about. We have our upper div with the 4 buttons, and then our lower div that has a sidebar and main content. So if it behaves as we described, then when I shrink this, we should see those buttons reposition themselves so that there are 2 rows of 2, and that's exactly what we see. Also pay attention to what's going down here. I decided that in this case, I would like the sidebar to take up 50% of the space if the screen got small enough. So as you can see, when it was large, the sidebar was taking up only about 25% of the space. But then as we shrink this, the sidebar gets more of the relative space. And then as we go all the way down to the phone size, our buttons line up one on top of the other. And you'll notice that I actually completely got rid of the sidebar. I figured that if we don't have enough room, then the sidebar is just optional. There's nothing too important in there anyway. You could do that, or you could just change it to something else. It's up to you. So let's take a look at the code to see how that was done. As you can see, I have 2 rows. And so this first row contains the navigation buttons, and then the second row contains the sidebar and the main content. As you look at the classes, you can see that we have a few classes being used. We have, for example, COL. We hadn't talked about that before. What's that doing? So take a look at our style CSS, and you can see that call, COL, is universally applied. It's not waiting for any condition on the screen size. So remember that we will have to do some styling in order to kind of get our baseline. So with the class of COL, we are able to define our columns, and those should be inline block, right? They need to line up right next to the other. And I put vertical align top on them. I also gave them some padding because I like it. You don't have to. You style them however you like. For the rows, I also gave them some universal styling. So for example, to make them show up a little easier for you to see, I gave them a border of blue. And so you can see that's what's giving them that blue border. Now comes the fun stuff, our media queries. So with our media queries, we wait and we check and see what the width is. And so this will be applied as long as the width is 480 pixels or less. So here's where we would define small 4. So if this condition is not met, if the width of the screen is greater than 480 pixels, we would not even look at this code and we wouldn't even know what the class of small 4 meant. But if it is small, then we would apply small 4, and set the width to be 100%. Small 0 would mean that we should take 0 columns, which is the same thing as just putting on display none. So when we go into our HTML, you can see that small 4 is being used on our buttons, so that when the device is small, they take up all 4 columns, which is, of course, exactly what we see. We see those buttons take up all 4 of the available columns. Meanwhile, small 0 is being applied to our sidebar, which means that our sidebar just disappears. You can see that we do the same thing by listening for when our width is 481 pixels. If we're at least at 481 pixels, then we'll apply medium 2. And so anything that has a class of medium 2 will now take up 50% of the available width. Finally, if we get all the way up to 1024 pixels, then we will use these classes large 1 and large 3. So anything with large 1 will get 25% of the width, and large 3 will get 75% of the width. And so that explains how our responsive design is working. And so just with those tools, you can build your own grid. You're not limited to just using 4 columns. A lot of libraries like Bootstrap and Materialize, they'll use 12 columns, so that gives you even more flexibility. You can place things even more accurately. However, take a stab at building your own grid. It will really help you to understand how the library's built-in grids are working, and you can really use them effectively that way. Great, have fun, and build some responsive websites.